and regular annual presentations of the data that we collect to those communities so that they are aware and they're engaged, because it's quite literally their ancestors that we are dealing with. So to kind of tell the story, we kind of have to go back to the very beginning. We know that the first ancestors of all indigenous Americans came from Northeast Asia, and everybody in this room probably knows that they crossed the Bering Straits when it was a land bridge and moved into what is today parts of northern Alaska, in that area, where they remained for a very long time, probably as long as 8,000 years, perhaps longer than that. People were living in the Arctic before they really started to make their way south and into the continental North America, below the ice sheets at that time. And there's still a lot of debate as to how that happened, the timing of it. But what we do know is that they arrived in the tropics of Belize. Let me get a laser pointer right here. They arrived here in the tropics at least by 13,000 years ago that we have direct evidence for. And most of you probably are familiar with Monteverde and the work of Tom Dillahay. People, similar time frame with very secure dates around 13,000 years ago, as far as Tierra del Fuego in southern Chile and Argentina. So very interesting. And what we do know is that as people were making their way southward, Paleo Indians were dispersing across the continent. When they reached this narrow point here in Mexico, which is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, they essentially crossed into a new type of landscape that humans in the New World had not lived in before. And this is the neotropics. So they crossed that boundary and they found themselves in these broadleaf tropical forests, which were a little bit different then than they are today. And this area is characterized by very high biodiversity and the sharing of large numbers of plants and animals across a very vast area from southern Mexico all the way through parts of Brazil and into northern Argentina. And so this area is quite important. And the work that I do is primarily focused on human adaptations to these environments early on in their histories. And this is a photograph here of where we work. And you can see it's a very thick, lush tropical rainforest. And one thing about working in a rainforest like this, especially with hunters and gatherer populations, is it's very difficult because we can't see the ground. We're all in New Mexico, most of us are in New Mexico, where you can quite literally see, anything that's sitting on the surface of the ground. It's not the case in the tropics. It's a little bit more difficult than that. So we do know that when people first arrived around 13,000 years ago, that the neotropics were probably about 6 degrees cooler than they are today, and they were drier, which means that even though we do have a lot of patchy savanna mixed in with gallery forests in the area today, that distribution was probably more biased towards savannas and less towards broadleaf tropical rainforests 13,000 years ago at the close of the last ice age. And we also know that these savannas support different types of plant, obviously, but also animal communities. And that's partially because there's a lot of grasses that are growing and that are really good and regular supplies of food for animal populations, especially larger animal populations, while rainforests themselves tend to be seasonal deserts. They have a lot of biomass, but they don't have a lot of fruiting plants that are really can support large numbers of animals. So one thing we've been looking at is the distributions of animals and plants in the past, as well as people and their artifacts. Some of the work that we've been doing, which was published 2 years ago in the journal Cell, has been looking at the genomics of the first people to live in this part of the world. And we were able to link individuals from Belize and also from Lapo de Santo in Brazil and Los Reales and several other populations to several waves of migration that occurred shortly after humans first arrived south of the ice sheets. So essentially what we know from genomics is that sometime prior to that, there was a split in populations that probably occurred in Alaska or somewhere in Canada that resulted in one lineage of people moving eastward and settling in southern Ontario, who were no doubt the ancestors of the Eastern Paleo Indians, who lived in, all across the Ohio Valley to Florida. And there was another branch that came southward along the west coast, and we know this from the Onsic child, which was a child skeleton found in Montana that was published. The genomes for that were published about 3 years ago, and some other genomes from the Channel Islands that represent this ancestor A. And out of this ancestor A group, we see these three, at least minimum of three migrations southward, one of which wound up in Belize, which is the people that we've been studying, and others wound up elsewhere. But it looks like this was pretty much a one-way trip. People were not back migrating at this time, but they were moving southward. And this was a remarkable study done by us in collaboration with David Reich at Harvard University and his group of scholars. And we also know that these people had different types of toolkits that they developed as they moved south. For example, we know that we have Clovis points that are found as far south as Costa Rica. That's the farthest we have Clovis points. We have a number of Clovis points that have been found in Belize as surface finds. Not a single one has ever been found in an excavated context, so we have no dates on them. And we also know that, that there are some what are called wasted Clovis points for these narrow bases and these slightly out-flaring bases that have fluting on them that are found in Panama. So these are kind of very closely related to the North American Clovis tradition, but we also have a almost contemporaneous tool tradition in South America of the fishtail point, which is a stemmed point that has a variety of different features to it, and that are not very frequently at all fluted. And the overlap of these points is right here in Belize. So we have examples of fishtail points from South America and Panama. We have examples of Clovis points. So this narrow area from Belize to Panama appears to have been an important mixing zone of people from both both people coming southward from North America, but also traditions from the South itself. But these traditions ended right around the time of the Younger Dryas, is when Clovis ends first, and at the end of the Younger Dryas, we have the end of the fishtail tradition, and we'll talk more about what follows that in a moment. So just to establish kind of a timeline of what we're talking about here, really, 13,500 years ago, and this time in this talk is going to be in years BP, because that's what we usually use in most of our publications that are in journals outside of archaeology. So we see around 14,000 years ago, plausibly, people are arriving, and they are hunters and foragers, so they are probably engaged in relatively passive relationships with the environment. But we also know that very quickly, certainly by 11,000 years ago, people are beginning to experiment with plant cultivation and horticulture. So they are actively engaged with plants. We know that we have domesticated chili peppers at Huaca Prieta on the north coast of Peru at 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. We have the earliest examples of squash being grown 10 to 11,000 years ago. So unlike the old world, where you have tens of thousands of years of foraging, going back to the first humans and even further back to Neanderthals, we have a relatively short period in the tropics of solid foraging and hunting for large mammals, and then a very kind of gradual adaptation to relying on horticulture, leading eventually to the first farmers around just a little bit younger than 5,000 years ago. We have the first maize farmers, and then we have the first villages that don't appear, which is what Phil and I were talking about a few minutes ago. We still don't see the first villages appearing until about a little before 3,000 years ago, or 1000 BC. And then we have the classic period, which is what you guys probably get a healthy dose of complex societies in the Maya from a variety of other speakers. So I'm gonna end my talk before we get to the classic period. So we're gonna talk about these early individuals first. So where we're working is in a quite remote place. On the left here, you can see a map of southern Belize. Here's the inset, there's the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Belize, tucked in here on the Gulf of Honduras, and it's a As Phil mentioned, it's a pretty remote area. It's not so remote today, but it was very remote up until about a decade ago. And it also has a very rich cultural heritage. This map here, the yellow dots are all classic period centers. None of them are as big as Tikal but a number of very important sites located throughout this area that had populations probably between 2,000 and 10,000 people, and then a very robust network of traditional Mopan and Kekchi Maya villages, which are the green dots on this particular map scattered around the district, that have grown rapidly over the last 30 or 40 years. Populations have grown and new villages have been formed. And then we have several pre-ceramic sites that I've worked at. One is down here, which I won't really talk about except a little bit of stone tools, which is called Sipteyush, right near the classic period center of Ushbenka. And then our more recent work, which I'm going to focus on and talk about today, is up here in the Maya Mountains, near two classic period centers, Exush and Mukle Bal Sul, at the rock shelters Sake Sul and Maya Hot Compact. And this is a really remote area. It's about 40 miles from the nearest road. So there's no way to get a pack animal or a donkey or a horse in there. So we actually, in order to be able to run a large project in this area, we have to use helicopters, which you can see here. We had to clear a helicopter landing zone out of this incredible canopied forest that has 200-300 foot tall trees in order to be able to create this landing spot to get us in and out, but also to deal with any potential emergencies. The area is very remote. And when I say remote, I mean it is completely off limits to people. It's a restricted area. It's patrolled by our partners with the Yashche Conservation Trust, who are the co-managers with the government of Belize. And tourists are not allowed in there. Adventurers are not allowed in there. School kids are not allowed in there. Nobody can actually enter into the preserve without research permits issued by the government of Belize. So it's pretty remote. It's got part of the reason it's kept relatively pristine in terms of not being logged or looted or having a lot of hunting is its remote. Its remoteness from anything else. It does have a lot of classic period settlements, which were the subject of study back in the 1990s and which we're rekindling a little bit. And where we work is in two rock shelters, which you're going to see some pictures of in a moment. And these are just some photographs of this incredible, really biodiversity rich rainforest that's full of all of the wild animals, like something out of the Jungle Book. So here is an inset map, and in this little inset map, each one of these squares is a kilometer. And you can see there's two classic period centers, Mukle Bal Sul and Exush, and then we have our two rock shelters, Sake Sul up here in the northwest corner of the map, and this is a picture of the rock shelter itself. It's about the size of 2 football fields, actually. It's a really big sheltered area. And then about 1.5 kilometers away from that is Maya Hot Compact rock shelter. Maya Hot Compact means in Kekchi Maya, the place of offerings. And Sake Sul actually means the white cliff or the white mountain in Mopan Maya. So it's characterized by this massive cliff. And as a matter of fact, I could point out to you that this cliff here, this lower right image here, is that cliff of Sake Sul. That is the rock shelter itself. So I started working there in the 1990s when I was a graduate student. That was the first time I was up there and did some preliminary testing and realized that there was very early materials. And then I got my degree and got a job and worked in the classic period for a long time and wanted to go back and further investigate these rock shelters to see if they might contain this elusive information from the classic period. In 2014, we began excavating, and over a number of years, we dug several very large rock shelters. The plan views of these rock shelters is here. You can see at the top is Maya Hot Compact with the excavations we've conducted in the 1990s, and more recently, this excavation unit here, excavation 1, which took 4 years to excavate. And below is Sake Sul, and you can just see how gigantic Sake Sul is compared to Maya Hot Compact. We have to do a blowout of it just to be able to see the arrangement of the excavation units we've put in there, and all of these have been dug since 2014. And you can see a couple of pictures here of some of my PhD students, mostly bioarchaeologists, excavating in a very, very deep pit here. And on the bottom, you can see two of our collaborators from the Maya communities who have been working with us for many, many years. Mateo Roche at the bottom excavating in this particular image. And I would just point out to you that this is, you don't get to see this very often. There's the modern surface on the top, and the levels that Mateo is digging into the bottom are around 12,500 years ago, and he continues to be going through cultural materials. So this is a continuous sequence, like a snapshot of the entire Holocene in one excavation, which is, again, very rare, and considering the level of preservation, we were quite fortunate. So here's just a few more images showing some of the excavations. A student, Asia Alsgaard from UNM, working with my field director, Mark Robinson from Exeter University in the United Kingdom, excavating these surfaces down very, very carefully. And myself in the bottom of one of these, you can see here what looks like a plaster floor, and that's exactly what it is. It's about a 7,000-year-old plaster floor, where they actually used calcium carbonate and water to create a durable surface to work on. And I'm down in levels that are about 13,000 years old. And then in the picture on the right is another bioarchaeologist from Los Angeles who worked with us, Marina Adame, and she's looks kind of like she's pondering the state of that excavation unit, because we're in a rock shelter. So it's kind of tough going, and people have to come out of those pits periodically just to take a breather. In terms of the chronology, you can see from the top, these are actually direct dates on burials that are represented here. These are the calibrated date ranges, and you can see we have burials running from about 1,000 years ago all the way back to around 9,600 years ago, in a relatively continuous sequence. Stratigraphically, these sites are very well intact. Of course, burials are intrusive features because people dig pits for them, so that kind of messes with the stratigraphy a little bit. But all things considered, there's no fluvial activity or no major rodent damage to the stratigraphic integrity of these sites. And I'll talk about the chronology in a second. We've developed a very robust chronology. One of our goals is to really try to determine the pace and tempo of use of these rock shelter sites over time and what they were used for, and that requires a good deal of effort and careful excavation, but also a good deal of resources to devote to chronology building itself, which to us is very important. And here's just a couple of ways you can look at the chronologies that we've developed using pretty simple statistics for the most part. And as of today, from these two rock shelters, we have we're up to a little bit higher than this now. We have about 225 radiocarbon dates, AMS radiocarbon dates we've run. And this is enough to actually begin to think about the dates as data themselves and to look at the sequence. We've tried carefully to date every stratigraphic level or context, and to directly date every single human burial on bone collagen itself. And you can see there's kind of a tempo, and this is the left side is just the straight sub-probability distribution of these radiocarbon dates, and you can see there's periods of intensive use just before 12,000 years ago, and then between about 9,000 and about 7,000 years ago, another intensive use. And then as we move through the archaic between 6,000 and about 4,000 years ago, there's another period of very intensive use. And then it falls off, and then there's another large peak after that in the Classic period. A little better way to look at this is what's called a kernel density distribution, which removes some of the error associated with having large age ranges for each of these to try and statistically narrow that down a little bit. And each one of those squiggly lines within this graph is which there's hundreds of, is an iteration of that kind of gives an idea of the probabilities of this, and it shows probably what's a more complete picture. And what this is basically telling us is that aside from a very short period of time, around 11,000 years ago, these two rock shelters were continuously used by humans throughout history. Maybe not every day or every year, but certainly, decades did not go by without people visiting them, which suggests to us that people were probably cycling through as part of their routines of, tending to plants, collecting resources, and hunting on a very regular basis. This would have been one of the fundamental areas that people were continuously returning to, both because they're large sheltered areas, but also to bury the dead. And we are finding burials, some rather remarkable burials. And we are also finding we have to be creative in how we document these burials because we're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, we bring in a lot of very fancy electronic equipment to help us with our work, including, cameras that cost thousands and thousands of dollars, and electronics suffer badly in this rainforest environment. But you can see Ola Shower holding up a blue tarp to filter the sunlight that's coming through the trees so that we can document this burial in the bottom of this pit. And this burial is 9,600 years old, which means it's one of the earliest intact excavated burials in the Americas, and it is certainly the oldest one from the tropics in this particular part of the tropics that's been recovered and well dated. We have a fairly wide range of burial ages of the individuals, so it's reflecting the lifespan of people themselves. We have a number of middle adult, young adult, middle adults. Very hard to distinguish middle and younger adults using their bones, especially when we don't know much about what people's life histories were at this particular time period. But that's where the majority of our skeletons are young adults or middle adults. We have a couple of older adults who are definitively have skeletons of individuals who are over 50 years of age. We also have very few children, only 5 children or adolescents, and a significant number of infants, which reflects undoubtedly infant mortality being relatively high in this time period, and 1 perinate, which was 8 lunar months. So it was actually buried in a formal prepared burial of a perinate. And the distribution that we've been able to accomplish in the lab of males and females shows a relatively equal number of men and women. The positions of these burials are very interesting, and nobody's ever really looked at, burial or mortuary practices in these deep time frames in this part of the world. Although a lot of work like this has been done in parts of the old world, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia. And we see that we have some unusual types of burials, which are extended face down burials. This is a really not very common type of burial either in the tropics or anywhere else. Here's an early forager. This is about 9,000 years old, who has been placed fully extended and face down, kind of unusual, and then was covered with rocks. And here's another extended face down, so a late forager, what we would call in North America the late archaic, who's also just kind of looks like he's been just kind of placed on some rocks and then was buried with more rocks covering the body itself. And you can also get a sense of the remarkable state of preservation. This one on the right is about 4,000 years old, maybe perhaps a little bit earlier than that, 4,500 years old. But the vast majority of burials that we have are in some degree of flexure. So the one on the left here is an agriculturalist, so a farmer, partially flexed. The legs have been folded back underneath the buttocks, although the body itself is not folded over the legs, and the spine is relatively straight. And then this very early, loosely flexed individual, this is the 9,600 year burial that I showed in the previous slide. You can see there's some flexure, but not tightly flexed. And the most common burial form that we have are very tightly flexed burials. And one on the left is a stunning example of this, where the knees are literally pulled into the chest and the arms are between the chest and the knees. And similar to this one here, which is an early forager. Again, this one is probably about 8,500 years old, based on radiocarbon. And we think that these are the most common forms of burials because these individuals, after they had died, they had to be carried up to these rock shelters. These rock shelters are on the sides of cliffs, and so to get up to these rock shelters is arduous enough on your own, but the idea of carrying a burial up there is hard to fathom, although it would be much easier if it was tightly bound into a ball and then you could put it on your back and use a tump line across the forehead, which is how indigenous people in the Americas have carried heavy loads for for thousands of generations, apparently. And we suspect that that's how they were brought up there, and then they were placed, bound into the shallow pits, and eventually the bindings just disintegrated. So we do have classic period burials, and I'll only just mention this one here, which was it's a primary burial, but it's also tightly flexed, and was found under actually a giant boulder at Sake Sul. We excavated underneath the boulder to find it, and it was in fairly good condition and was buried with. We know that this is a farmer because we know it from the isotopes in the skeleton. This is about 2,800 years ago, so about 800 BC. And these vessels here, which are these are middle formative ceramic vessels. Here you can see a closer look at them. The one on the left has what's called a resist-ware crocodile face and profile. You can see the open mouth there. You can see the teeth. You can see the sloping forehead of the crocodile. Very, very cool, beautifully preserved intact vessel from around 800 BC. And the one here is this is very similar to what are called chocolate pots that have been found in northern Belize. I think Phil probably knows about these from his time working at Cueto. This is a number that have been found dating to the same time period. They're not very functional though. This is what you'd call a false spout vessel. The spout is real, it'll pour out, but if you filled this up with chocolate and tried to pour it out, the angle of the spout means that the liquid would pour out of the top of the vessel at the same time. So not very functional, but it probably was used for some type of a design for more of a mortuary purpose than for a day-to-day spouted vessel. We also have a number of interesting relationships between individuals, genomic relationships between individuals, and I'll only touch on these two. We do have a number of, we have some first-degree relatives that would be parents and children or siblings, full brothers and sisters. We have some second-degree relatives, and then we have some third and fourth-degree relatives. Third and fourth-degree relatives would be cousins. So these two individuals are adult males who were buried together on the same surface, so a prepared rock surface that was then covered, and they were kind of intertwined with each other, like they were in an embrace, or they were, you know, they were definitely, one had his head resting on the shoulder of the other one. And these are second-degree relatives. They're both adult males between 35 and 50 years of age. They share a congenital unfused sacral bodies, so that's part of their spine is unfused, and this is a congenital defect in their bodies. And because they're second-degree relatives and they're both males, they would either be grandfather, grandson, half-brothers, or uncle-nephew. They're one of those three relationships. There's no other possibility for this degree of relatedness that we've been able to obtain from the genomics of these two individuals. So the genomics is really helping us not only to learn about ancestry, but also to look at the construction of family units within these particular contexts. So I'll talk briefly about some of the work we're doing. I won't have time to talk about every aspect of it because it's really rather involved, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the early paleogenomics that we've been working on, some of the technology, and then I'll wrap this up with a little discussion of the title of the talk, which is The Maze, although all three of these topics kind of blend together in terms of understanding people and their subsistence. And there you can see me with one of our German collaborators, who's a geochemist and a paleoclimate scientist and an avocational archaeologist. He's also reconstructing climate in the area in front of one of our excavation units at archaic. So here's this figure again that we looked at the very beginning of this talk, showing the migration of these individuals. And we were able to begin to understand these relationships between people through this remarkable study, which was headed by then graduate student Cosimo Poth, who now runs a lab at the Francis Crick Institute, an ancient DNA lab, and all these authors, like 40 authors, because we were looking at skeletal materials from sites all across South America, and then the only known well-preserved skeletons from these early time periods, which come from Maya-Hakapek and Saki Sul, in this kind of remarkable study that showed the common descent of all these individuals from the Western Clovis tradition. So all native Central and South Americans came from the Western Clovis break of Ancestor A and Ancestor B, which is the first part of it. And what we do see from our skeletons, And so far we've only published on the full genomes of 3 individuals from Iahakampeck and Saki Sewell, and they are dating between 7,300 years ago and 9,300 years ago. So 9,300 years ago would be very late Paleo-Indian and kind of early archaic here. So this figure on the right kind of is showing the relationship between our 3 ancient individuals, and all of the circles on the map are modern indigenous populations. And the closer a dot is to red in color, the more related they are to our individuals. So no surprise, we see a lot of red dots here in the Yucatan and in Guatemala, because these our ancient individuals are most closely related to descendant communities, modern indigenous communities in this local area. What we see is that they are far more related to modern South American people than they are to modern Mexicans, Mexican indigenous people from central Mexico, southern Mexico, and northern Mexico. And then if we move to these few genomes that we have in Canada, we see that they're not very related to those individuals. So this is one of the things that suggests that most of this was southward during the Paleo-Indian period, and that the structure of these relationships suggests that people continued to primarily interact with over time and to share genes with people from the neotropics, within the neotropics, and that the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and that break between the Nearctic and the neotropics is not just ecological, it also was guiding for early humans. This is a very different story when you move into later people in the Maya area, which you'll have to come back next year when we've got our paper published on that, and that'll be hopefully out by this summer. And this is really neat kind of work that was not possible a decade ago. These massive improvements you see in the media all the time in ancient DNA allows us not only to look at indigenous populations today, but to mask out from those genomes European and African ancestry that would have been part of the European expansion and linked to historical times. We can actually mask out those aspects of the genomes. So yes, the neotropics. We're really intrigued by that. And I guess this slide just kind of covers what we've already kind of said. We know that here's this kind of movement. We know we have 17,000 years ago is around the time of this ancestor A, ancestor B split. And then we have this movement of population southward by 10, 12,000 years ago. Our earliest skeletons in Belize are right around 10,000. And simultaneously in South America. I mean, people were very successful. These early foragers managed to survive in the Arctic for 7,000 years, basically a bright, brilliant white landscape of ice and snow, to move into North America and to very rapidly and successfully disperse throughout, Mexico, the kind of the drier areas of Mexico, and then to wind up in South America. And surprisingly, we don't really have any ancient skeletons that are well preserved from Mexico, aside from a few from cenotes or water-filled caves that are not preserved well enough to extract DNA or even to directly date them. So one thing we can say about populations in this time period is that we see that populations settled in these areas, and as they settled, they gradually coalesced. So people interacted with people local to them for the most part early on, and we see by around 9,000 years ago that populations are forming, local populations are forming, and this is probably giving rise to linguistic diversity as well as cultural traditions that continued on for a very long time. Whoops, I've lost my screen. And eventually we begin to see populations filling in the gaps. So we do see one hint of what's to come is that the most recent DNA that we have strongly suggests that around the time of the domestication of maize, there's back migrations from the northern Amazon and lower Central America, the Isthmian region of Colombia and Panama, back into the Maya lowlands, with people sharing DNA back northward at least that far, prior to the establishment of cities and states. And so certainly prior to the development of the Mesoamerican tradition. So what are they using? What are the kind of the stone tools? Well, I'll say the vast majority of stone tools we're finding are the stuff on the left. Tens of thousands of stone tools used for all kinds of things, from chopping to cutting to grinding. The A, B, C, and D, excuse me, are chirp tools. A and B are kind of chopper tools. They're unifacial. C and D are choppers, but are actually discoidal scrapers, formal discoidal shapers. They're flat on the bottom. They're often called turtle shells where we work. They look kind of like a turtle shell. They're quite sharp and quite a useful tool. Most people are using a lot of porphyritic rock that's found in the Maya Mountains because it's an ancient volcanic range. They're just getting this stuff out of the rivers. They're bringing it up to the rock shelters. They're pounding and cutting and chopping with it till it breaks, and they're just throwing it away. There's so much of it. It's very, very expedient. And then we're fortunate to have found a few formal bifaces. And this is an example of what's called a low point, a low biface. And these date to the example here we found in 2019 at Maya Kapek. And of course, we can't directly date the stone tool, but it was found securely in levels dating to right before 9,000 years ago, 8,700 to 8,900 years ago. These are beautiful stemmed points. These were obviously discarded, but they're large and they're very interesting. And they're very interesting because in Central America for a long time, as a matter of fact, well over 4,000 citations of different articles that cite these points as being 4,000 years old, right before agriculture or late archaic points. And they were assigned to that period based on the work of Scotty McNeish, who some of you might know is actually an abuse of Scotty McNeish's work because he thought they were really old. But some of his students thought they were younger, and they excavated one that they found near to a piece of charcoal, not with a piece of charcoal, but near to a piece of charcoal on the top of a sterile surface that dated to 4,000 years ago. So they classified the 150 or so of these points that come from surface finds as being late archaic. But then we started finding them in our excavations, and we've now found 5 of them, 3 of which are complete, 2 of which are partial. Of these, they have alternate edge beveling, which is also similar technology that's found on Folsom points, but also some points in the Amazon. Some of them are stemmed, like this example here, A in the image, not stemmed, but fluted. Some of them have fluting, or most of them have basal thinning flakes. Very few of them have actual formal fluting. And the chronology we have for these, which we published in this article in +1 in 2019, runs from around 8,000 years ago to around 9,500 years ago. So, I'm sorry, to about 11,000 years ago. The oldest one, which is this bifacial fragment here, it's the tip of a point, which is alternate edge beveling, is right around 11,000 years ago. So this is right after fishtail. This is right after the disappearance of fishtail, the last South American bifacial technology. And here's just some images of these other bifaces that are low-like or have been associated with low that have been found as surface finds in Belize. Here's one that's solidly a low. You can see the thinning on the base of it here. This is a very large one, probably the most intact one we have. A lot of these are very reduced. They've been resharpened over and over again until they're too small, then they're discarded. Here's another one. You can clearly see the flaking on this edge and no flaking on this side. This is the alternate edge beveling. Some have very thin bases that are called, allspice points. And several other local varieties. This is called a Yashche point because it was found by the rangers from the Yashche Conservation Trust and was sufficiently different to afford its own name. So in the last year or so, I've been working with Anthony Raniere, he's retired now. He was at Temple University. Some of you are probably familiar with him. He spent his career working with Richard Cook in Panama and Costa Rica, and he was the intellectual father of Dolores Paperno, who's probably the most famous paleobotanist in the domestication of maize. And Tony was like, we find these points all through Panama, Colombia, and northern through northern Costa Rica and Honduras. And what you can see in this image here is you can see points A through M are lower Central America and northern Colombia, and all the rest of the ones and below are from Belize, almost all of them found as surface finds. And so Tony published a paper in Quaternary International this year in 2020, talking about a regional late Paleo-Indian tradition of bifaces. And I'm on board with that. It came after we published the one there. But the most interesting thing about this is that in 8,000 years ago, all across this region, there's no more bifaces. Anybody who's familiar with North America knows that bifaces continue right up through to the contact, but in the neotropics, they stop making bifacial points and it's over. They don't make them again until the classic period, until the middle formative again. So there's about a 6,000 year period where there's no bifacial technologies employed at all. So I guess I should put this up first. We have a distribution from southern Chiapas to Brazil, and these stemmed points, these late Paleolithic stem points, they date from 12,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. The sites that they're found at and other sites that have been excavated show no evidence of bifacial thinning debitage after 8,000 years ago. So it's not just that we're missing the points. We're not missing the point, so to speak. It's just they're not being made. There's no evidence that this technology that's specific to making bifaces is being employed after 8,000 years ago. And this actually corresponds strongly with the increasing reliance on domesticates at about 8,000 years ago. So as people are moving towards plants, they're giving up these heavy, time investment kinds of prestige bifaces, which were originally developed along with Clovis for hunting much larger animals. So it's really interesting. And this is the title of this article by Anthony Ranieri and Richard Cook, which came out this year, 2020. It's very, very interesting for anybody who would like to read it. So this rather complicated looking figure is essentially the bulk of it is looking at when we have the first appearance in the neotropics of different domesticated plants in the record. So the timeline here, again, BP from 14,000 to 4,000 years ago, about a 10,000 year timeline. And I've divided into northern Mesoamerica, which would be central Mexico, what most people think of as being where maize was domesticated, southern Mesoamerica, which is where I work, lower Central America and Amazonia, and the north coast of Peru, which seems to be kind of unique. And I've kind of couched this with the stone tool technologies because it's useful as a visual aid. So in southern Mesoamerica, we know we have Clovis. We don't have any dates on it because none have ever been excavated. We have fishtail, and then we have our stemmed and barbed points, which I talked about in that last slide. And if in the Isthmus region and in the Amazon, we have Clovis, only in the Isthmus, but not in the Amazon. We have fishtail tradition coming up from southern South America all the way into lower Central America. And then we have this stemmed and barbed tradition that Tony Ranieri has documented so well. And if we look at the role of this in domesticates, what we see is a few things. We see that cucurbita, which is squash, is originally domesticated around the same time in the Amazon, in lower Central America, and in northern Mesoamerica, right around 10,000 years ago. It's the first domesticate squash. Domesticated microbotanical remains of these have been found, as well as starch grains and phytoliths from stone tools. We see the domestication of manioc by around 8,500 years ago in the Amazon, and manioc is native to the Amazon. It's not native to Mesoamerica. The wild, in other words, the wild precursors do not grow there. And we see manioc appearing in the Maya lowlands by around 6,500 years ago, which means it's definitely being moved up northward from the Amazon during this time period. And these are the domesticated varieties based on phytoliths and starch grains. And then we have corn. Corn is like the most interesting plant in the world. Your drywall is made of corn, in case you didn't know that. You're living in a corn world. And we are definitely C4 creatures. The earliest known domesticated corn is from Mexico, and it dates to 8,900 years ago. It was identified by Tony Ranieri and Dolores Paperno, his student, along with Ruth Dickow, and published about a decade ago. And it's based on starch grains and phytoliths of domesticated corn dating to 8,900 years ago. And here's the story of corn, which I think is the coolest story in all of New World archaeology right now. We know that corn was domesticated from a wild precursor called teosinte, which has two varieties that grow. One is the variety that grows in the warm tropical lowlands here in the Balsas River Valley, which is where Dolores Paperno and Tony Raniere found the earliest maize phytoliths. And then there's another highland variety of teosinte called Mexicana, which grows in the highlands of Mexico, including the Tehuacan Valley, where Scotty McNeish worked and where a whole bunch of people worked for a long time on early domestication. And we know that there's very little resemblance between teosinte, which you can see a cob of here. It's kind of got several seeds stacked on top of another, and corn, which forms in rows and has a protective husk. But yes, this is what happened. It's thought that maize mutated from teosinte in a single event. So there was a single mutation in a single plant that resulted in corn. And that this was then selected for by humans over time. But if we look at the work that's been done in Mexico, in particular at San Marcos Cave, originally by Bentz and by Smith, 4,000 years later, after it was domesticated, the earliest domesticated corn is still tiny. This corn cob from 5,300 years ago is 1.6 centimeters long. That's a complete corn cob. That's like the size of the tip of your pinky finger. Nobody's making tortillas out of this stuff. It's too small. You have to grow 50,000 plants to get 10 pounds of corn. So what's going on? Why is this not domesticated? Here's other examples from San Marcos Cave, from Malabueno and Estrada in 2016, who went back and excavated in hazmat suits to not contaminate it, to get more corn cobs to do the DNA on them. And it turns out these are not fully domesticated varieties of corn. And part of what is happening, we need to go back to this slide, is because they're being grown in the same area as both the wild precursors of teosinte, they keep crossbreeding back with the wild varieties. And this impedes selection, and particularly selection for traits that we associate with modern corn. So this is why 5,000 years later, corn is still not fully domesticated in Mexico, because it's just this introgression back and forth is probably acting as a counterweight to human selection of traits in corn that are favorable to humans. And so what are people doing with it? We don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of speculation. Maybe they're making beer out of it. That would be a very human thing, to make beer out of something that has a high sugar content. But it's not being farmed as a staple grain at that time. So here we have this first one from over here on the left side from Dolores Paperno. Here we have the ones that are still partially domesticated at, right around 5,500 BP. But then we have this story here. So this article was published by Logan Kistler from the Smithsonian Institution, as well as some students of some colleagues of mine at Exeter University in Science in 2018. And they started to do the ancient DNA and look at the chronology of corn in South America. And what they found was that corn very early on made it to the Amazon. These early varieties of corn that were domesticated and were being farmed for whatever reason here. In fact, we have our 8,800-year-old corn here in the Balsas River Valley, but then we have corn that's in Panama, domesticated corn at 7,500 years ago, 6,700 years ago on the north coast of Peru, and 6,500 years ago in the Amazon basin, 6,000 years ago in Bolivia. There's a lot of corn happening. And what they found was that a lot of these varieties underwent secondary domestication, or what they called secondary improvements in the Amazon, because once they were removed from the wild varieties that are growing in central Mexico, selection actually was able to work much faster, and they were able to select the traits they wanted and breed the crops that had those traits. And it went much quicker. And we see that in all likelihood, the traits associated with modern corn, multiple rows of corn, multiple seeds, husk that protects it, ear shattering that happens at a particular point in time, the ability to dry it on the stalk. These are probably traits that were domesticated into the plant in South America, and then it moved back northward again. and then was remixed and probably then helped to speed up the domestication of other varieties that are being grown in Mexico. It's a very complicated story, but this is very much brand new. At the same time, there's this massive revolution in understanding ancient agriculture in the Amazon. For example, this article published in Nature in 2020, just last year, by Humberto Lombardo and his colleagues, and my colleague, Jose Uriarte, is looking at all these different early sites, maize at 7,000 years ago, maize at 6,000 years ago. Here we all these different cultigens. These are farming sites. This is like massive farming on a scale that was unknown, happening 8,000 years ago, really early on. These are the Amazonian farmers, and this is a blowout here from where they conducted this research into these raised bed fields and then deep trenches to obtain evidence. And the evidence comes in the form of these phytoliths recovered from these excavations and well dated, as well as phytoliths from stone tools. So really, really a cool story. Then, of course, there's this paper, which was published just last month or 2 months ago in December of 2020 by Tiffany Tung of Vanderbilt University, along with Tom Dillahay, who many of you are probably familiar with, looking at maize. We've long known that maize cobs were found on the north coast of Peru at Huaca Prieta, and the site that's 1 kilometer from Huaca Prieta called Paredones. But what they're finding is they've finally been able to do some of the isotopic work on some of the skeletons, and that what they're finding is that corn is being consumed by people in sufficient amounts for it to be detected in their bone collagen on a limited basis 6,500 years ago to 6,000 years ago, but that people are consuming it as a staple crop by 5,000 years ago. This is the earliest known consumption of corn as a staple crop. And when I say a staple crop, I would tell you that the isotopic data from cluster 5, from cluster 2, show that they're eating about 50% of their diet is coming, greater than 50% of their diet is coming from C4 protein or corn itself. And they're able to actually filter this out to remove the influence of other C4 plants and seafood, marine resources, by looking at different mixing models based on animal feeding studies where they feed mice and other animals different diets, and then they extract samples of their bone, collagen, and characterize the diet based on those particular features. So really interesting stuff. So this was not known until a couple months ago. So now if we go back to this chart again, we can see this kind of, it's a different story. So we have the initial domestication of maize in Mexico just before 9,000 years ago. We start to see maize in lower Central America by just before 8,000 years ago. We get it in the Amazon as a microbotanical sample at around 7,500 years ago. Then we get this early maize consumption at Huaca Prieta, and we have stable maize consumption at Huaca Prieta by 5,000 years ago, far earlier than we see it in the Maya lowlands or in Mexico. And then this article, published the last 2 days of 2020 in PNAS by Logan Kistler again and his colleagues, showed some corn cobs that were recovered from a cave called El Gigante in Honduras, where it was excavated by a graduate student in the 1990s, and they found 4,000 corn cobs that date back to around 5,000 years ago. Most of them, the early ones, they could not extract DNA from. They were not well enough preserved, but these are not burnt, so they just were badly preserved. And what they found was that around 2,000 years ago, they were able to get DNA out of these cobs themselves. And these cobs are direct lineage descendants from the varieties domesticated in the Amazon. So the direct lineal descendants of those, which means that there was definitely movement of the corn varieties from South America back northward into Honduras, and probably into other areas as well, where it would have been mixed with other maize crops and helped the domestication process along. So why are we even talking about all this? Okay, let's go back to some data. If you haven't figured out yet, I like squiggly lines. So here's some more squiggly lines. This is actually our radiocarbon chronology of the human burials. So each one of these little squiggly lines that you can see lined up here on the side is a radiocarbon dated human burial from Maya Hot Compek and Saki Sul. And this is a paper we published in 2020 in Science Advances. And we've kind of divided them into three groups. The pre-maize diet in green up here, dating from around just before 10,000 years ago to around 4,800 years ago. And then in the bottom, let's skip the middle for now, we have our staple maize diet. These are farmers. These are people who roughly 70% of their diet is coming from maize. And these are transitional people. These are people who are experimenting with maize. These are individuals who are not yet maize dependent, but are consuming some maize at our rock shelter site. So these are our foragers. This is the beginning of maize consumption 4,700 years ago. So just about, a little less than 1,000 years after Huaca Prieta has the first experimentation with maize. We're seeing it in the Maya lowlands. And then it's about a 700-year period, 7th century period, before we see people beginning to consume it as a staple grain. So people went through several centuries of building up reliability and trust, mitigating risk and everything with this new crop before they fully became hooked on it. And they never looked back. Mesoamerican people and native people in the Southwest and Mexico, once maize became the staple of the diet, they never looked back, and they continued to make beer out of it too. So we've run several different types of analysis to show this. These are plots of, the top plot here is a pretty traditional isotopic plot. We're plotting bone collagen. This should read nitrogen. This is nitrogen on the y-axis and bone collagen. Here, what we see is here's our farmers all clustering together over here with isotopic values of around -7 to -12. One is over here at 13. This is in the range of modern farmers. And these background dots here are the ones that are grayed out. These are classic period Maya farmers in previously published data from all over the Maya lowlands. Over here in the green, these are our foragers. These are our pre-maize foragers who are not consuming maize. And this is where we begin to see our transitional movement in the diet. And these two individuals here who overlap with the foragers are actually consuming some maize, and we had to actually plot it against the parameters of the experimental diets that were done. And when we use the data that way, we're plotting bone collagen here against bone appetite here. We see that they cluster again very tightly. The farmers seriously discriminate from the foragers, and our intermediate people also fall along a continuum between the two. And the same thing here, we've plotted this in a mixing model. 50% of the diet, we don't have anybody in that with marine protein. We don't have any marine protein consumers here. Here's 100% C3 plants. Most of our foragers fall into that. Here's this box here is 70% C3 diet. 70% C3, and most of their diet's also coming from C3 protein. So the animals are also eating wild plants in the forest. And over here, we begin to see this transition moving through this until we get to here, and all of our farmers have roughly 70% of their diet coming from maize. So really interesting stuff that we've been able to flesh out from here. So with that, I will open it up to some questions if anybody has questions. This is my long list of collaborators. You can imagine my email inbox is usually pretty overflowing to try to keep all of these ducks lined up at any particular point in time. And I thank all of you for being here. And I'll take any questions. You're muted, Phil.
I don't really have any questions, Keith, but that was really an awesome presentation.
Thanks.
It was really exciting, really interesting news, and really interesting facts to see the transition from these early paleo people into disbursements across Central and South America. It's really, really quite fascinating, really quite awesome. So congratulations to you on your work and to your colleagues. That's really groundbreaking stuff that I'm sure a lot of people are going to be interested in watching and looking at over the next few years as more and more technology changes our ability to really look at archaeology in a much different way than we ever dreamed possible. So congratulations to you, and good luck.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, the technologies are changing, and we're experiencing a revolution in archaeology, which is the use of ancient DNA that was not possible even a decade ago. If anybody hasn't read it yet, I strongly recommend David Reich's book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, which is really kind of, it's 2 years old, but it's already it's already outdated parts of it, but it's just a fascinating view of this. I mean, this is the largest revolution in archaeology since radiocarbon dating was designed by Libby in the 1950s. It's going to revolutionize the way that we think about people. And when you combine methods like ancient DNA with methods like isotopic analysis, you can really begin to understand the lives of people. We're actually starting a new project that's looking at extracting cortisol from ancient human teeth to be able to evaluate the ratios of stress on people's lives at different junctures, which will give us an insight into health that just was not possible a few decades ago. We're working with a group at the University of Oklahoma on dental calculus to look at parasite, bacterial, and viral loads in humans and identify pathogens in the past that were affecting these populations. And we will be extending that to looking at a large population of 250 to 300 skeletons from the classic period as well. So, you know, these are really we're really able to today to begin to understand the lives of people in ways that was not possible in the last 100 years of archaeology.
Yeah, I think it's really bringing in the DNA and in with the archaeology is like where it's all going. Definitely, because it just means so much more, and it's so much more data to build on. And I think isn't most of the corn and prehistoric in the Caribbean, is that all South American origin? That you
Yes, corn would have made its way to the Caribbean via, I mean, there was just a paper published last month on the genomics of the Caribbean. So, and it looks like most of that is coming from Colombia and Venezuela. And, you know, starting 5,000 years ago, I think is the oldest skeletons they have there. But maize comes later. Maize comes when there's probably regularized transportation networks connecting.
3,000 or so. Yeah, it just seems like corn could have gone from the Yucatan to Western Cuba, right? But I don't think they've ever found Mexican corn in Western Cuba.
Right, and they did not find Mexican DNA in Western Cuba either.
Right.
And anywhere in the Caribbean. It looks like the people are, well, I mean, you get it later on, but later on, late prehistoric, you get, you know, much more kind of economic integration linking Cuba in particular to the Yucatan. That's not surprising at all. But the southern Caribbean is like, populations are coming straight out of South America.
Right, not early Taino. They're all Arawak and Carib, I think, descended. Yeah. So I was wondering about the feature in the rock shelter, and there are thermal features that are multi-use, like that look real seasonal, accompanied by lots of animal bone processed in there.
Can you repeat that? You were breaking up a little bit.
Oh, I was wondering if in your rock shelters in Belize, if there's animal bones being processed, like a lot. So it looks like domestic with lots of thermal features.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even talk about it. I think we have a NISP of 37,000 animals.
Okay.
Representing all of the diversity of tropical rainforest mammals, birds, and amphibians. So it's a really massive collection. And during the pre-ceramic period, prior to the establishment of sedentary communities, it looks like it is the diet. I mean, that's what people are processing. There's a lot of thermal features. There's a lot of burnt bone. There's a lot of cut marks, a lot of butcheries. So people are processing animals for food in the rock shelters and ostensibly cooking them there as well. During the classic period, it's a little different. It looks more like it's limited processing and more people are living in that valley in houses, so people are preparing most of their food at home and not in the rock shelters themselves. Yeah, so those studies will be. I have graduate students working on those aspects. So in the next couple of years, we'll be seeing more of those data.
So maybe even the early archaic people thought of rock shelters as part of some spiritual underworld, or you think you wouldn't go that far?
No, I think that's a fair question, and I think we're starting to see that there's likely a linkage between these mortuary practices early on and later kind of classic period, my ideological considerations of mountains and caves and water as being spiritually charged environments. And I'm sure that those classic period ideologies have their roots in the kind of stuff that we're seeing early on. And this isn't just here. This is also some work that's been done in South America also has had large mortuary populations from the archaic as well. So I think it's a kind of a Amerindian kind of foundations of ideology that's going on with people. And I've talked to other people who think that this stuff is also much older, coming from the old world as well, that these were parts of ideologies that follow people out of Northern Asia and through the Americas. Some of the oldest known burials come from places like Spirit Cave in Alaska. So yeah.
Blombos, yeah, South Africa. Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the beginning. So here's a question for you. How did you discover those remote rock shelters?
When I was a graduate student doing my PhD fieldwork in the Maya Mountains as part of a larger project that kind of ended around the year 2000, we were surveying for caves and found these rock shelters and actually excavated a couple of units in one of them, and with a very famous bioarchaeologist named Frank Saul and his wife Julie Saul. We published it at that time. We published these burials, but we had no idea how old some of the burials were. We only dug a shallow unit in the upper classic period levels. So, but that was what sparked my interest in these. That was 25 years ago.
Wow. So this is probably a no-brainer. Those large projectile points, those are all spears. There's no atlatl technology at 8,000, you think?
We don't even think that these are very good throwing spear points. They're very heavy. And I don't know how effective a spear would be in a rainforest. It's got a lot of trees. If you have a tree every 20 centimeters. We think they're more thrusting harpoon type spears. So yeah, spear as in the not throwing spears. We think and there's been some experimental work that's been done suggesting that the weight of these points, that they would drop a spear pretty rapidly. You get some upward motion, but it would come down pretty fast. So not good for not really good for an atlatl. These are clunky large stone tools, but they were certainly hafted, the stems would tell us. And that sharpening technique, that alternate edge beveling, is really great for knives itself as a resharpening technique. So probably I would say these were the Leatherman or the multi-tool of the archaic.
Right. And that chert, is it pretty local to nearby the chert, or is it coming from the other sites like Pusila and?
No, it's pretty, most of it looks like it's local chert. Right now there's a dissertation that's going to be defended, I think, next month at Arizona State, of somebody looking at the mobility of the chert sourcing. And some of it might be coming from Polha, but that's a small minority of it. Most of it's pretty local, and yeah, it's coming from right in the rock shelters or in the valleys.
Right. Is Shbinka and Pusila then, is some of their chert from Kolha that far away?
Yeah, but usually it's in special deposits. So that's stuff that
Uh.
would have been fairly valued. I mean,
Right.
Coal chert is found as far away as central Mexico. It's found as far away as, Ceibal, and it moved because it's a very high quality product for making large tools.
Right.
Yeah, but we don't see necessarily. Well, we might have one piece that's coal hot that's archaic, but that would be it.
Okay, don't want to take up all the time. Anyone else have a question? The corn, Dr. Ford, he's been on here, and yeah, we go over the corn process quite a bit, the DNA.
That's good.
It's real interesting, yeah.
And there's new stuff to write about coming out as we speak. So.
Okay. All right, well, I guess we'll end it here, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thank you very much for coming to talk to us, Dr. Prufer, and hopefully we'll all get back in the field pretty soon. And
We can only hope, yes.
do what we do. Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll
All right.
see you some other time. Hopefully we'll get this ASNM conference going, and yeah, we need a Maya conference in Taos.
Put it together.
Bring all the Mayanists. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah.
All right.
They
Take
love
care.
Taos.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
See you.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
See you in March.